brief decade between 1900 and 1910, electric cars gave the combustion engine a run for its money. Both were hideously expensive modes of transport and out of the realms for most people here and abroad. The first electric car was this one, designed and built by Thomas Parker in 1884. His simple method of promotion of his new vehicle was to drive it to and from his Wolverhampton home to his factory and back. Then the tube came along and trumped all forms of motoring in the United Kingdom. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche came up with a hybrid car all the way back in 1898. Look at the beast. If hybrids today were even 10% as sexy as this one, you wouldn't need other road users in New Zealand subsidising their use. At the beginning of the 20th century, long before we heard the rantings of a teenage Swede, electric cars were seen as the future of transport. The way battery technology was advancing, it was forecasted that the combustion engine would soon be playing a second fiddle. So what happened to the predictions that were made over a century ago that EVs would dominate the roadscape from Iceland down to New Zealand? And their demise then remains essentially what it is today. Petrol cars became cheaper, way cheaper. The EV's range was limited. Charging locations were limited to metro areas. And then what to do when the battery crapped out? Once you've watched this video, by all means feel free to plonk it on your Facebook or whatever as a free history lesson, because history is repeating. As I've mentioned, the EVs then, and the ones available even today, had limited ranges. This negative selling point was okay to start with, say in 1900. That's because the roads then were glorified goat tracks. For example, the first car to travel 500 kilometres between Auckland to Wellington in 1905 took a week to make it. Cars themselves had only arrived in New Zealand 7 years earlier. It wasn't unheard of for owners to have to import their own petrol. When the roading infrastructure was established, there was a Bowser in every town, and travelling 100 kilometres or more became practical for everyone. A vehicle that could only make it 60 kilometres didn't stand a chance in the market against one that could, particularly one that wasn't particularly good at going up hills either. The final straw for EVs as cars was when World War I broke out, and the armies, navies and air forces of the world went for the ready and reliable form of energy, being fossil fuels. There was, however, other areas of human transportation electricity-driven vehicles clung on to after the war, which was mostly lost by then for the standard cars. They still had a fingernail hold and advocates in the fields of trucks, buses and trains. Here in New Zealand, there was at one point in the 1920s about 300 electric trucks operating up and down the country. Per head of population, New Zealand was once the global leader in EV use. This picture taken in 1920. It was taken on Beeley Ave in Christchurch, just outside the Carlton Hotel, for those familiar with the city. All those vehicles are electric. And then on top of that, you also had train and bus routes using EVs. Leading the global development of electric vehicles, and a whole lot more, was Thomas Edison. Edison's nickel-iron batteries were strong, lightweight, steady rechargeable power source. The Edison Storage Battery Company started in 1901 and produced batteries for a whole range of uses, from miners' hats to Navy submarines. If Edison could be considered one of the fathers of the electrical vehicle and storage, the son term could be bestowed on a New Zealander. the one-time assistant chief of Edison's US research department, the Whanganui-born electrical engineer Ambrose Harris, the man behind most of those trucks and the cars you saw in that photo. I'll get back to Harris shortly, because although he worked for Edison between 1910 and 1913 and later became Edison's New Zealand agents, he wasn't the first person to start importing EVs into New Zealand. That mantle falls down to this bloke, the former mayor of Gisborne, William Leisner, a devotee of electric. He drummed up enough initial capital from the ratepayers and took off overseas in 1910, where after visiting London he met with Edison himself to take a first-hand look at his electric train range. That's him in a Detroit electric car with Edison. When he got home and the green light for the project from his fellow councillors had been received, they ordered the first 2 of 4 battery trains. Leisner also took advantage stateside to get himself one of those newfangled electric cars, and similar to this, which I would rather be seen driving as opposed to a Nissan Leaf. It's a 1909 Brougham Detroit Electric, which I believe, and stand to be corrected here, was the first electric car to come into New Zealand, late 1910 or early 1911. If you have more details on this, plonk it in the comments. The Brougham Detroit Electric became the shopping basket for his wife Ida. There's a footnote here. There is a rare 1904 Baker Electric in Canterbury somewhere that was imported from the States sometime relatively shortly. Anyway, the trams started operating in Gisborne in April 1913, and in doing so, Gisborne became the first place in the Southern Hemisphere to operate battery-driven trains/trams. The third one arrived in 1917 and the last one in 1919. The project was regarded by Leisner's rivals and large chunks of the electorate as personal folly. The project lost money from day one, culminating in 2 referendums in 1926 and 27 as to whether to scrap electric trains altogether in preference to diesel buses. The citizens of Gisborne voted twice to replace them, the last one rolled out silently in July of 1929. That was 18 years after Leisner was basically forced out of office when the public became aware of the bottomless pit in debt he had saddled them with. Now back to Harris, who by then had returned from the States and based himself in Christchurch. The Edison Agency in 1914 was the modern-day equivalent of having Samsung today. Phonographs, microphones, electric bulbs, mining equipment, etc., etc. One of A.R. Harris's first big contracts was the construction of the Lake Coleridge Hydro Power Station near Christchurch. Later on, he created New Zealand's first independent radio network that had stations from Whanganui down to Invercargill. It is this broadcasting aspect of his life that he is best remembered for. Those 2 steel broadcasting towers you see in front of you, plonked in the middle of Christchurch, were both 155 feet tall. And Mr. Harris didn't just have that agency. Remember that Detroit Electric Mrs. Leisner was trotting about Gisborne in? That was the brand name for a Detroit manufacturer called Anderson's. Harris himself drove one of them, as well as selling them. That's him. I will give you 15 seconds to get your head around why he's sitting in the back seat. Read the text and you'll get it. Magnus Sanderson's in Wellington were also their agents. Their 1917 advert aptly describes them as a drawing room on wheels. Then there was Harris's biggie. The number one seller were the Walker electric trucks manufactured out of Chicago using Edison technology. The first one arrived in 1917. The one on your screen now was imported specifically for the Municipal Electricity Department of Christchurch and went on the road in 1918. Rather amazingly, it is still about today and owned by Orion, which morphed out of the MED, but is still largely owned by the Christchurch City Council. Top speed 25 kilometres per hour, and when fully charged and loaded, it could make a bumpy trip of 60 kilometres. The interior was rather basic, and as you probably already noticed, the driver would sit directly over the wheels. Harris clipped the ticket on the recharges as well. The central recharging depot in Christchurch ran off electricity sourced directly from Coleridge. In some cases, Harris just sold the batteries and people would knock up their own bodywork. Some of the larger transport companies imported their own EV trucks. New Zealand Express in Christchurch, for example, had the agency for all wheels made in the UK, and they could also be seen on Dunedin roads for decades as trusty workhorses for the local council. Before we get to the buses and my favourite, the train, let's look at some of the photos of electric trucks over this period, some of which were still in use in the early 50s. The big issue here was what to do when the battery lost its charge. Effectively, it was all but scrap. The battery was, after all, 75% of the cost of the vehicle. Today it's about 25%. Still, in my books, 100,000 kilometres isn't a lot of Ks before you have to replace your engine, in inverted commas. Here are those photos of electric truck fleets. Yes, you're correct, I said fleets. All those trucks lined up outside the Waitoa dairy factory near Hamilton in 1921 are Walker electrics. The same with Rongotia near Palmerston North. They had 19 there, trundling up and down Manawatu roads between 1918 and 1925. A.R. Harris was also front and centre with the electric bus as well. Feast your eyes on this. Modern buses look spiritless in comparison. I don't care where it's going. I want to hop on and ride. Ride, baby. His range also had other applications. Tugs. Cranes, delivery vans, maintenance vehicles. If you want a further range of photos of peerless workers in New Zealand before health and safety came along, I've done not one but 2 videos to amuse yourself with. Links in the description. That's before we even get to the EV train marketed by Harris's Railway Storage Battery Company. It was a hard sell. The overall cost being $1 million in current dosh. So much it required cabinet approval. That also didn't include the cost for the charging plant. Like the bus, there was just one, and it operated between Christchurch and Little River between 1926 and 1932. The 60-kilometre journey, including 12 stops, took a little over an hour and carried 60 passengers. At the time, that was super fast and super smooth. Harris provided all the running gear and Christchurch company Boone and Stevens built the 17-metre long carriage. The underframe and batteries were first assembled in Wellington, where test runs between Petone and Thorndon took place before being completed in Christchurch. Technically, therefore, the first battery train ran in Wellington, as other test runs took place there, with axles to represent the weight of a human load. The first official paying passenger run took place on the 30th of June 1926. By August, it was going to and from Christchurch to Little River at 7:30 every morning and returning by 10:30. Would get a quick top-up and then make the same journey starting in Christchurch at 5 o'clock in the evening. Did it make money? Yes, to start with, for the first few years. The battery train, however, still faced competition with the bus service, which was always cheaper. There were also issues with the rail tracks themselves, which forced the train to operate at reduced speed, bringing it on par with the bus journey. The final nail in its coffin was this. The Great Depression brought the guillotine down upon electric cars and trucks as well. New Zealand Rail began closing down all their unprofitable lines. The final run was February the 2nd, 1932. The train remained in storage at the Christchurch Rail Depot in the prospect economic times would turn around and they could get another outing. Unfortunately, the warehouse it was placed in suffered a fire in May of 1934, and with it ended New Zealand's experiments with EV trains. The Christchurch Little River passenger service itself ended in 1951, and the track was closed full stop in 1962. Far from dead, it's now a popular cycling rail trail. One thing for sure, with a video like this, viewers will be able to leave their own comments and add to this story, and at the same time probably correct me where I went wrong. Don't you forget those health and safety videos, they are a real hoot. And thanks for tuning in. I will leave you with that amazing photo taken 100 years ago, and thanks to all the people and organisations that preserve photos like this. I will spot you next time. Bye for now.